The DS is considered the golden age of Pokemon, but there's more than just the main series games. There was a ton of side games that came out for the DS, from dungeon crawling adventures to tactical RPGs, racing games, and even a typing game. Pokemon wanted to try out a little bit of everything, and it all started with Pokemon Dash, which released on March 14th, 2005 in North America, December 2nd, 2004 in Japan, March 11th, 2005 in Europe, and April 7th, 2005 in Australia. Pokemon Dash is really weird. It was the very first Pokemon game on the DS, and it's not your typical experience that you would come to expect from the mainline games or even any other side game. It's a racing game, which is a great idea for the Pokemon series. You play as Pikachu, who runs, flies, and surfs across various courses with the goal to finish in first place, just like any standard racing game. The courses have a good amount of variety, and you can even hijack a Lapras to just shoot across to a different island. If they ever make another Pokemon racing game, I expect to be able to hijack a Pokemon. As cool as a Pokemon racing game is, the controls really hold it back. You control Pikachu by dragging the stylus across the touchscreen to guide him around obstacles and through checkpoints. The DS was brand new at the time, and everybody was trying to make the most of the new touchscreen. But was this really the best way to do it? Being the first Pokemon game released for the DS, the expectations are gonna be pretty high, even if it is a side game. And getting a Pokemon racing game seems like a no-brainer, but this just isn't what I want. You get the top screen, which functions as a map, and the bottom screen you see Pikachu and you control where he's going. And it looks fine, the courses are bright and look pretty cool, and getting to see Pikachu race across different landscapes was an interesting take, but only having the track being visible on the bottom screen really constrains what you can see. If they just extended it out like other games on the DS, I'm sure it would have worked so much better. I love the idea of a Pokemon racing game, but Dash was an awful racer. Trying to control a racing game only using a stylus is terrible. You're just constantly swiping over and over again with the stylus, which leads to the gameplay feeling like you're competitively signing your name at a checkout kiosk. If you didn't have the hand steadiness of a surgeon, you would end up making Pikachu crash or fall off the track entirely. And for a Pokemon racing game, why can I only play as Pikachu? It's called Pokemon Dash, not Pikachu Dash, and this left me, and I'm sure a lot of other people, wishing for way more variety in the gameplay and characters. It had some interesting ideas, like if you put Fire Red or Leaf Green into the GBA slot of the DS, you could unlock special tracks shaped like different Pokemon, which in theory is awesome. I'm glad they had extra content, but with the gameplay being as bad as it is, I didn't want to play them. I think I'll speak for everyone and say that a Pokemon racing game would be awesome, but if they make it like this, I will throw my Switch at a brick wall. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team, released in North America on September 18th, 2006, in Japan on November 17th, 2005, in Europe on November 10th, 2006, and in Australia on September 28th, 2006. Blue Rescue Team was a split release with Red Rescue Team, where Blue came out for the DS and Red came out for the Game Boy Advance. The gameplay here is from Red Rescue Team. Please don't beat me up. Being the first Mystery Dungeon title, it really shook up the Pokemon formula. Instead of being a Pokemon trainer, this time you are a Pokemon. You take a personality quiz at the start of the game, and based on your answers, you get turned into one of several different Pokemon, like Charmander, Squirtle, and of course, Pikachu. But I will take this test as many times as I possibly need to in order to get Psyduck. Look at that confused face and tell me that doesn't resonate with me. The Mystery Dungeon games are known for having incredible stories. You wake up as a Pokemon with no memory of being human, and you team up with a partner to form a rescue team to help other Pokemon in need. Together, you'll explore randomly generated dungeons, save Pokemon, and try to uncover the mystery of what turned you into a Pokemon in the first place. This game was an incredible success for so many different reasons. First off, the story was way more emotional than anything we were used to in the mainline games. This released before Diamond and Pearl did, and compared to the first 3 generations of Pokemon, this had a much deeper story. From the moment you start the game, it guides you into building a connection with the character you get. By taking the quiz about your personality, it helps you build a much closer attachment to the Pokemon you get. It helps you to feel like you are that Pokemon. Beyond that, the idea of waking up as a Pokemon with no memory of how you got there is a cool twist. And as you progress, the friendships you make with the Pokemon around the world are really meaningful. It's a really heartwarming journey, and it's surprisingly deep, especially for being such an early entry on the console. Of course, the bread and butter though is the dungeon crawling mechanics. Every time you enter a dungeon, the layout changes, which means no 2 runs will ever be the same. It's a roguelike Pokemon game. It gives you a great feeling of variety every time you play through it. The battling is still turn-based like the main series games, but it only happens when you move your character, which adds a great level of strategy and action to the mix. By not moving, you can take a second and think about how you want to approach every encounter. But to be honest, it took me a while to become a fan of this series. It wasn't really my type of game, but once I got into it, I was absolutely hooked. The emotional depth of the story made it hard to put down. There's a load of different Mystery Dungeon games in other series, but this translated to Pokemon extremely well. But being the first game in the series, it wasn't perfect. It had really bad difficulty scaling, especially in the later parts of the game. If you faint in a dungeon, you lose all of your money and items, and it can be super frustrating to go through all of what you had just done just because you lost one encounter. Getting to the end of a dungeon only to lose everything was hard, especially when the game is difficult to begin with. Also, besides a cosmetic change, most of the dungeons are pretty much the same. The base gameplay is pretty repetitive and it doesn't change all that much throughout the game. You enter a dungeon, destroy everything in sight, and save the Pokemon at the end. Don't get me wrong, it's not a bad thing, but it just takes a while to get used to. Now, Red Rescue Team and Blue Rescue Team had some slight differences, but they're pretty much the same game. I would recommend checking either of these out, but Blue Rescue Team is definitely the harder one to come across. You can play Red Rescue Team on Nintendo Switch Online, which is not the case for Blue Rescue Team. But the best way to experience it is by playing Rescue Team DX, which is available on the Switch. It's a remaster that improved almost every single aspect of the game. So if you're gonna check it out, that's how I recommend doing it. Pokémon Trozei, released on March 6th, 2006 in North America, October 20th, 2005 in Japan, May 5th, 2006 in Europe, and March 30th, 2006 in Australia. Pokémon Trozei is a puzzle game, but with Pokémon's faces. In Europe, this game was called Pokémon Link, so depending on where you live, it might be known by a different title. Like most puzzle games, the goal is to line up 4 or more of the same Pokemon in a row or column to clear them off the board. You have to clear as many Pokemon as possible within the time limit or before the board fills up. There's a loose storyline where you play as the Lucy Fleetfoot, who's a secret agent tasked with rescuing Pokemon from the Phobos Battalion. To me, Phobos Battalion sounds like an insult, but I can't really tell. As far as puzzle games go, this is pretty good. You're not catching or battling any Pokemon in this game, instead you're just freeing them by solving puzzles. It's a nice fun twist on the typical Pokemon gameplay, even if the format has been done to death. If you're a fan of puzzle games, you'll really like Trozei. The mechanics are pretty easy to pick up, and it makes it a pretty addictive experience for people who like quick thinking, fast-paced puzzle games. It was simple but satisfying, and it had a fun mix of Pokemon from a bunch of different generations up to the point. My only issue with the game is that it didn't really offer much in terms of depth. Once you got a hang of the mechanics, there wasn't really anything to keep me hooked, especially compared to more complex games like Tetris or Puyo Puyo. So many companies have done some kind of puzzle matching game, so it makes sense that Pokemon would want to toss their hat in the ring. And they didn't make a bad game by any means, it's just a really oversaturated market. It doesn't really do anything to stand out. I like puzzle games, so I enjoy it, but I can't say that it's worth checking out if you don't. Pokemon Ranger, released in North America on October 30th, 2006, in Japan on March 23rd, 2006, in Europe on April 13th, 2007, and in Australia on December 7th, 2006. Pokemon Ranger is a really interesting series that doesn't get talked about as much as I thought. It took the traditional mechanics of the Pokemon games and just threw it away. Now, if you're a fan of circles, I'm sure you're going to love this game. Instead of being a trainer who catches and battles Pokemon, you play as a Pokemon Ranger, who's a special type of Pokemon protector who works alongside Pokemon in the Fior region. Your main tool is the Capture Styler, a device that allows you to draw circles around Pokemon in order to temporarily get their help to solve environmental issues. You'll see a Pokemon, and you'll draw circles around them like a madman. What's not to like? Taking on a brand new role in the Pokemon universe did a lot of things to help the series out. It allowed you to see that the Pokemon world is so much bigger than battling and training, and I'm sure it made PETA calm down just a little bit. The unique gameplay of using the stylus to draw circles on the touchscreen was fun for a little bit, and it required actual skill. Especially as the game goes on, you're trying to capture more powerful or agitated Pokemon. It was an action-packed alternative to the usual turn-based combat that we know from the main series games. The idea of protecting nature and working alongside Pokemon for the greater good of the region was a good twist. But as cool as the Capture Styler was, it had a few drawbacks. If you weren't accurate with your stylus or your hand slipped at all, your capture would fail, which could get extremely frustrating, especially as the game went on. I understand this was absolutely a skill issue on my part, but with the main series games, you just had to throw a ball and hope you got lucky to catch a Pokemon. But if you miss for a second, you are starting over. And with how many Pokemon you have to catch throughout the game, the mechanic got pretty repetitive after a while. Especially because you can't keep any of the Pokemon you capture. You catch them once and then have to release them after they're used. But still, it was a unique experience that deviated from the standard RPG formula. And it was a great introduction to the Pokemon Ranger series as a whole. I really want more games in this series to come out. I understand why they haven't recently, considering they weren't the most successful, and the Switch doesn't have 2 screens to allow for this, but a man can dream. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness, released on April 20th, 2008 in North America, September 13th, 2007 in Japan, July 4th, 2008 in Europe, and June 19th, 2008 in Australia. Explorers of Time and Darkness took the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series to new heights. As sequels to Red and Blue Rescue Team, they took everything that was great about the originals in the series and improved it. You once again wake up as a Pokemon with no memory of your past, but now you find yourself in a world where time itself is starting to collapse. But first, you have to take a personality quiz to figure out what Pokemon you will be. And of course, they cut Psyduck, so I'm upset about it. You meet your partner and you join an exploration team to set out on a quest to uncover the mysteries behind the time disruptions that have been happening. You meet a bunch of great characters along the way, and somehow the story is even better than the original. It touches on themes like betrayal and sacrifice, and the twist at the end about your character's true identity hits so hard. Like in Red and Blue Rescue Team, you journey through randomly generated dungeons, recruit new Pokemon for your team, and uncover the secrets of time and darkness as you battle the forces of evil that threaten the world. After playing Red Rescue Team, the improvements in time and darkness were a breath of fresh air. Of course, the story was richer and more engaging somehow. The memorable characters like Grovyle, Dusknoir, and Wigglytuff all are incredible, and getting to form a genuine bond with these Pokemon led to one of the best stories Pokemon has ever had. The best part though was the expanded roster of Pokemon that you could recruit. You could now recruit Pokemon up to the 4th generation like Piplup, Chimchar, and Turtwig. The added variety not only created better team building strategies, but it also just included some fan favorite new Pokemon that had come out in Diamond and Pearl. Just like the originals, it had the roguelike dungeon crawling mechanics, but with better difficulty balancing and a more interesting boss fight system, which made it feel like a better experience overall. They really didn't hammer out all of the difficulty issues though, especially towards the end. It can be extremely unforgiving. And just like the first games, if you faint in a dungeon, you still lose all of your money and items, which can be incredibly annoying if you weren't prepared for the challenges ahead. It did a better job at feeling less repetitive, but the gameplay loop is still very similar from dungeon to dungeon. But even with some of the minor issues, it was still an incredible game. The story alone is something that is worth playing to this day. And even though it's slightly out of order, this is the best time to mention Explorers of Sky, which released on October 12th, 2009 in North America, April 18th, 2009 in Japan, November 20th, 2009 in Europe, and November 12th, 2009 in Australia. This is a deluxe version of Time and Darkness, similar to how Platinum was to Diamond and Pearl. It brought some big improvements and additional content that make this the definitive way to play these games. The story is pretty much the same. You wake up as a Pokemon, join a rescue team, and embark on a quest to stop the world from falling apart. But what Explorers of Sky adds is new stories called Special Episodes, which dive deeper into the backgrounds of key characters like Bidoof, Wigglytuff, and Grovyle. The side stories don't seem like a lot, but it really makes the entire story come together and feel more cohesive. It helps some of the more emotionally charged moments in the story to feel even deeper. And getting to see more of the characters that you've come to know is a really great thing, especially when the story is as good as it is. It even added some new gameplay mechanics like new items and moves, which made the gameplay feel even more crisp. There was even an expanded post-game which gave players who wanted more to do after finishing the main story the option to get even more juicy details about the plot. As a deluxe version, this did a perfect job of taking what was great about the originals and adding to it without changing too much. Now, if you owned Explorers of Time or Darkness and you wanted to get this game, I don't feel like it's all that worth it. It didn't add enough to justify the price tag, but if you're looking for the best way to play through this game for the first time, then this is the ideal way to do so. Pokémon Ranger Shadows of Almia, released on November 10th, 2008 in North America, March 20th, 2008 in Japan, November 21st, 2008 in Europe, and November 13th, 2008 in Australia. As the second game in the Pokémon Ranger series, Shadows of Almia takes everything that people loved about the original and improved it. You once again play as a Pokémon Ranger, but this time the story is set in the Almia region, where your goal is to protect the people and Pokémon from a mysterious organization known as Team Dim Sun. You start out as a Ranger in the Ranger School and quickly work your way through the ranks in the Ranger hierarchy. Just like the original Ranger games, you'll use your stylus to draw circles around Pokemon to temporarily enlist their help. But this time, you can now have a partner Pokemon who will stay by your side throughout the entire journey, offering new abilities to assist you both in and out of battle. And this was an incredible change, because you no longer had to say goodbye to your favorite Pokemon once they used their moves. Shadows of Almia improved on nearly every aspect of the original Pokémon Ranger. The story was deeper and more engaging, with Team Din Sun being a much better villain group than Go Rock Squad was. But even more than having a better story, this game feels like a much better version of the formula they tried to get in the original game. By choosing a partner Pokemon who would stay with you for the entire game, you had the connection to the team that was missing from the original. And it made it feel like it was a more authentic Pokemon experience, even though the gameplay mechanics were still focusing on drawing circles. Yeah, you didn't think you were going to get away without drawing 1,000 circles, right? You capture Pokemon the exact same way as you would in the original by drawing circles around them, but this time it has a much better UI, so you know how much left you have to do. The missions were much more varied, with a wider range of objectives other than capturing Pokemon who were looking to cause chaos. You were still rescuing Pokemon in danger, but you were also investigating mysterious incidents and even facing off against Team Dinsun's leaders in some intense events. The new variety kept the game feeling fresh, and they really listened to the complaints that people had about the original. And I'm sure you know that I love drawing circles as much as anyone around, but I understand it's not for everybody. It could be really difficult, especially when the stylus wasn't as responsive as you want it to be. If you had the original model DS and you tried to play this game, it was not very responsive. When I replayed it on the DS Lite though, it was definitely a lot better. But even so, the capturing system still got repetitive after a while, even with the added variety in the missions. Even with all of the quality of life changes though, the early part of the game still feels slow, especially compared to the more action-packed mainline games. But in my opinion, I think this is the best Pokemon Ranger game by a pretty large margin. It is absolutely worth checking out to this day, and it's a shame they haven't tried to make a new game in the series, even though I understand why they won't. Pokemon Ranger Guardian Signs, released on October 4th, 2010 in North America, March 6th, 2010 in Japan, November 5th, 2010 in Europe, November 25th, 2010 in Australia. Guardian Signs is the third and final entry in the Ranger series, and it brought some fun new mechanics with it. Of course, you play as a Pokemon Ranger, but this time you're set in the Oblivia region. Your goal is to stop the Pokemon pinchers from capturing and controlling Pokemon using forgotten ancient technology. And no, they're not just taking 2 rocks on a stick and whacking Pokemon until they listen. It introduced a new mechanic, which is the namesake of the game, Guardian Signs, which are mystical symbols you can draw on the touchscreen to summon legendary Pokemon to help you in battle. These signs allow you to call on Pokemon like Entei, Suicune, and Raikou to assist you on your missions. Along with your partner Pokemon, you get to explore new areas, solve environmental puzzles, and just experience the great Oblivia region. Of all of the Pokemon Ranger games, this is my favorite region to explore in, even if this game isn't my favorite. The Guardian Signs mechanic as a whole added a great new dimension to the gameplay, which is sorely needed. I love the first 2 titles, but there's something about being able to summon legendary Pokemon that was a dream come true for people who got bored of the original mechanics. And the signs themselves were a good change of pace to draw on the touchscreen if you got sick of circles. Now don't get me wrong, I never get sick of circles, but I like the variety. The Guardian Signs gave the game a more magical feel, especially since they summoned legendary Pokemon, which were harder to obtain in the original main series games. The plot had a larger focus on legendary Pokemon than any of the other titles in the game and any Pokemon game overall. You'll meet a bunch of legendary and mythical Pokemon throughout the game, and it was nice to be able to see these Pokemon in their natural habitat. Another great new addition to the game was the inclusion of multiplayer missions, which allowed you and up to 3 friends to team up together on local wireless to tackle special missions. This made for some really exciting multiplayer experiences that added to the replay value for those who wanted to share the adventure with friends. But if you're like me, who only had one other friend who even heard of the Pokemon Ranger series to begin with, you didn't really get to play him that much. Now, like in the past 2 games, the capture mechanic could still feel really repetitive, especially for people who didn't like drawing circles. As if you could ever get bored of that. The Guardian Signs did spice things up enough, but the core gameplay remained pretty much the same, which didn't really appeal to everybody. Even though this game had the best gameplay, it's not my favorite, and the main issue I have is that the story was a little too out of left field. With the first Ranger titles, the story was more grounded, and it felt like something that a Pokemon Ranger would actually do. But in this game, you meet so many legendary and mythical Pokemon, it seems like they were just throwing every single Pokemon they possibly could to get this game to sell well. Also, the multiplayer missions were a good idea, but you were limited to playing on local, so if you don't have friends with a game nearby, you couldn't enjoy the content well. But overall, the series is really underappreciated. I recommend giving all 3 of these games a try if you have the chance. Learn with Pokemon Typing Adventure, released on April 21st, 2011 in Japan, September 21st, 2012 in Europe, and January 10th, 2013 in Australia. Learn with Pokemon Typing Adventure is exactly what it sounds like, a typing game. In Typing Adventure, you play as a student in the elite typing club, which is a bunch of nerds, and your goal is to get through various typing minigames of Pokemon as they appear on screen. In some games, you're putting in the first letter of the Pokemon's name, and other games you're typing out the full name before they get too close. And if you are fast and correct, you will capture them in a typing ball, and the faster and more accurate you do it, the higher your score will be. Now, if you're wondering why I didn't list an American release date, it's because this game was not released in the United States, because the only words we need to type is America and freedom. Out of the box, the game came with a special wireless keyboard that connected to the DS, and it featured over 400 Pokemon to type and capture. But since this was an educational game and it was aimed for improving players' typing skills rather than pure fun, it was fine. Each level increases in difficulty as you progress, adding more complex words and faster Pokemon appearances. If you're able to get your hands on it, it's actually pretty fun. Say what you want, but it's a unique spin on the Pokemon franchise, and for younger players who are looking to improve their typing skills, it was a surprisingly enjoyable way to learn. It featured a pretty wide variety of Pokemon from different generations, and completing the Pokedex by typing out all of the different names was a fun challenge that instilled every Pokemon name into my head forever. I had to import this game from Europe, so it was years later that I actually got to play this, and as someone who could type pretty well by then, it was fine overall. It took me a little bit of trying out different keyboards to get the game to work, but once I did, I can say that I got at least 1% better at typing the word Venonat. It's an educational game, so I'm not going to sit here and say this is a must-play by any means, but if you're looking for something that's really out of left field for Pokemon, it's worth looking into. Pokemon Conquest, released on June 18th, 2012 in North America, March 17th, 2012 in Japan, July 27th, 2012 in Europe, and June 21st, 2012 in Australia. It's almost like Pokemon wanted to save the best for last. Pokemon Conquest is a tactical RPG, more similar to games like Fire Emblem than the standard RPG games that Pokemon are known for. It's a crossover between Pokemon and Nobunaga's Ambition, which is a series that has been running in Japan for years. If I pronounce that game right, you have to subscribe. In Conquest, you play as a warlord in a feudal Japanese-inspired Ransei region, where Pokemon and warriors fight alongside each other in turn-based strategy battles. The story revolves around a prophecy that says whoever unites all 17 kingdoms in the Ransei region will summon a legendary Pokemon, Arceus, and gain incredible power. As a new warlord, your goal is to recruit all of the other warlords and their Pokemon to build your army and conquer the rival kingdoms in hopes to fulfill the prophecy. Each warlord had a partner Pokemon with a unique ability, and your goal is to strategically outmaneuver your enemies in a grid-based combat game. It took me years to truly appreciate this game, and I'm glad that I did. This kind of turn-based tactical battle was a refreshing change of pace on the usual Pokemon formula, and the added historical and cultural flavor was unlike anything we had seen before in the series. This game is just dripping with style, and it's great to see that all the historical flair works so well with Pokemon. I was hoping that when we got Pokemon Legends Arceus, it had a little bit more seasoning like this game does. The strategy game elements are still there, like managing your kingdom's resources, recruiting warriors, and strengthening your army. And it gave this game loads of depth and replayability, and it's a game I come back to far more frequently than I think I would. The different pairing of each warlord with a specific Pokemon was a great touch. They all had their own affinity for certain Pokemon types, which was a great idea. It meant that you had to strategically think about how to build your army and use those type advantages in battle. And it even featured a bunch of legendary Pokemon like Mewtwo and Rayquaza, which made me feel even more like a conqueror. If someone rolled up to my house with a Rayquaza, I would respectfully move out. My only issue I can think of with this game is that if you're not a fan of tactical RPGs, you will not like it at all. The learning curve here is incredibly steep, so if you didn't have a prior knowledge of tactical RPGs, there was a good chance you weren't going to enjoy it. And as a Pokemon game, you'd expect it to be pretty simple, but being based off of a different series, it makes it far deeper than any Pokemon game we've ever seen before or after it. It can be pretty challenging, especially if you weren't used to grid-based combat. You might find yourself struggling what moves to make and at the right time. But overall, this was the most different game that we've ever gotten from Pokemon. Getting to see Pokemon in a historical context like this was really cool, and I really hope we get another Pokemon Conquest game in the future because I just cannot get enough of this series. If you're a fan of tactical RPGs, or if you're looking for a strange Pokemon game to play, this is absolutely worth checking out. And with the wide variety of games released for the DS, I'm not surprised Pokemon had some really big successes in their spin-offs and some pretty big failures. Whether you wanted something mind-numbingly simple or something extremely complicated, you could find it here on the DS. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope that you and your family have an incredible rest of your day, and if you like anything that you saw here, please consider subscribing.